begin, as always, there's a prayer on top of your handout. The language is a bit old-fashioned, but we can get through it. Please pray with me. In thy mercy, O God, hear our prayers and be near us when we call upon thee in the sorrow of our hearts. May the thought of thine infinite love bring comfort and consolation to all those who mourn, for thou alone canst heal our wounds and dry our tears. Help us, and we shall be helped. Heal us, and we shall be healed. For thou alone art our true helper. From thee comes healing of all our ailments and consolation in our sorrows. Amen. Amen. So we're going to talk today about the binding of Isaac. You might I know this story as a sacrifice of Isaac, but he doesn't get sacrificed because God intervenes in the end. So we're going to go with a Jewish title, which is, they call it the binding of Isaac. So I've been thinking the last couple of days how to start talking about this story, and all I could come up with was, so this is a hard story. Right? So like, to think about back to 2 weeks ago, we talked about the flood story, right? Again, it's this sort of cute story, but actually it's terrible because, God kills everybody but 8 people and pairs of the animals. Somehow this one seems worse, right? Even though God isn't killing everybody, but the idea that God would command a father to kill his own son seems rather terrible, right? So it's another hard story. It's also been there's no shortage of ink spilled on. So there's whole books. People have written entire books just on this chapter. One of the most famous ones is, you've probably heard of Soren Kierkegaard, his book Fear and Trembling. That's what this book is all about. It's how do we deal with this, right? And Kierkegaard, of course, thinks this story is about great faith, that Abraham demonstrates great faith. He obeys God even to the point of being willing to kill his own son, right? But it's a hard story. One commentator puts it this way. I didn't have room for this on the handout. I wanted to pack some Bible verses on here. But one commentator puts it this way. Abraham and his God are appalling. If this is the test, then it would seem that both have failed miserably. Both the one who devised the test and the one who submitted to it. What kind of a God commands a father to sacrifice his only son, lets him go through every agonized emotion, and then halts the action just as the knife has greased the top of its arc at the very moment of the ascent into the boy's throat? What kind of a father accepts these terms of this loyalty test? No, under no circumstances, get thee behind me, Satan. That would appear to be the right answer to this particular command, right? This is a pretty hard story, right? There are other commentators who think Abraham actually fails the test. That what he ought to have done is to tell God, no, this isn't the kind of God that you are, right? You don't ask these kind of things of us. That he ought to have been said, if you need a sacrifice, take me instead, right? The one place I can't quite go with that reading, even though I have sympathy for it, is if you look over on column 2 in my handout on the first page, I've got a passage from Hebrews 11, where the Bible itself tells us that Abraham had great faith, and he had hope that God could raise Isaac from the dead, right? So this is a story, especially if you've grown up in a church, you've heard it over and over and over again. And I think when we hear these stories over and over and over again, we get a bit desensitized to them, right? And we can explain it away. Isaac isn't actually killed at the end. God intervenes, and it's really about Abraham having great faith, right? And he's an example to us, right? And of course, we also can make all kinds of connections between this story and Jesus. So if you look on the top of my handout, on column 2, I've got John 3:16, right? And I put it in the version we're all used to, right? But we've got this whole idea of this is your only begotten son, right? And God is willing to sacrifice his son. He's willing to do that, even though he doesn't in the end ask this of Abraham, right? So these are some ways we can explain this story away, right? Isaac's actually spared, but Jesus isn't, right? And of course, God does all this for us. So we do all these things to make this story more palatable. I think we should sit with it and wrestle with it and realize just how awful it is in certain ways, right? To at least let it make us uncomfortable. So when I was preparing for this, I of course was getting some books off my shelf, and of course there's whole books dedicated to it. I was surprised though that some of my favorite go-to books for Old Testament passages didn't even touch it, or they would give like a page. The other thing we do is ignore it. So we either kind of make it palatable and find ways to do that, or we just ignore it, right? I think this is a really helpful story, not only in terms of what it's saying, but if we want to learn to read our Bibles better, this is a good test case, because it's a good example of what happens when we take a story and isolate it or pull it out of its greater context, of what we end up doing with it. And I think this is a story where we really need to say, what's going on around it, right? How did we get here, right? So it's a good lesson in, we will understand it better if we read it as part of a whole rather than a standalone story, right? So if you went to a church already, I haven't heard the sermon, but I have a good idea of what it's about. It's on one of the parables of being lost and found, right? And if you think of those, so there's 3 parables that Jesus tells in Luke 15 about being lost and found, right? They aren't sort of timeless nuggets of wisdom. They're stories Jesus tells in a particular context, right? What's the context? The Pharisees are saying, Jesus, why are you hanging out with sinners? And Jesus basically has to tell them, well, because that's why I'm here. I'm here to find lost sinners. And when they're found and they repent, we throw a party because we're happy. You should be with me on this, he basically says to the Pharisees. But the Pharisees have this idea that God only wants to hang out with holy people, not sinners, right? So how does Jesus get that point across? He doesn't explain it abstractly. He tells 3 stories, right? You actually won't understand the meaning of those parables if you don't get the context that they're in. I want to point out that we need to do the same thing with this kind of a story. So we're going to spend some time unpacking this a bit, right? So if we do this with this story, let's figure out what we're going to find. I'm going to warn you. I'm going to paint a picture of Abraham that's probably different from the one you're used to hearing, right? I'm not going to be very kind to Abraham. So one of the more popular understandings of this story is that Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son is a sign of great faith, right? We're told that God is testing Abraham, right? We don't know that, God does. I mean, Abraham doesn't know that, but we do, right? And we're basically told that because Abraham didn't withhold his own son, God's going to bless him, and more importantly, the whole world through him. So again, this is a good thing Abraham had this great faith. We should aspire to have it too. By the way, there's whole schools of Christian ethics that think that they take this story as their model. That the way we should think about ethics is God gives us a command, and it could be different from time and place. So yes, most of the time we are not supposed to kill people, but God could give us a particular command to go kill someone. If that's the case, we should obey it. So we should think of ethics that way rather than sort of principles and norms. Personally, I find that way of thinking very scary.
Especially if you're a son.
Right. Well, exactly. I mean, that's kind of the idea of God told me to, and I want to be like, well, how do you know it was God? Right. And I think Abraham should sort of, there's an element here of Abraham ought to have said, like, who are you?
Yeah.
Anyway, right, just, again, it's this sort of hard thing, right? The other thing that's, I think, really worth pointing out in this story is we aren't ever told how Abraham is thinking. We have no insight into his mind, right? This is, by the way, almost every ancient text I can think of. The idea that we can get into the character's head and know what they're thinking and feeling, that's a modern thing. Most ancient texts don't do that. It's more like a movie of we're seeing what's happening, but we have to figure out how the characters feel. So we aren't ever told, is Abraham upset? We just assume that he is. But we don't know what's going on in the side of his head, right? He's obedient. He does what God tells him, right? And again, what we see is a person who God tells him to do a thing, and he does it, and so he's held up as a person of great faith. I want to say things are more complicated, right? So here's my first move, and you don't have this on your handout, and I'll go back to all of this. So again, the story begins with, after these things, God tested Abraham. God appears to him and says, Abraham, and Abraham says, here I am. That's the only words he speaks to God. God tells him to go sacrifice his son, and he gets up and goes, right? And there's actually a book I was reading about this called Abraham's Silence, because he doesn't say anything. He doesn't ever talk to God again after this story, right? He just does what God tells him, right? But what happens in this is chapter 22, what happens earlier? So we get this after these things. I'm going to ask you to think a little bit, and it's okay if you don't know, but what happens in chapter 21? This isn't on your handout, so. Right, so what are those things? That's what I'm asking you. Again, let's think of it in its context, right? Well, here's your hint, right? What does God tell him? He says, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go and sacrifice him. Does God apparently have all the details right here? Because how many sons does Abraham actually have? He's got two. Who's his other son? Ishmael.
Right.
So in chapter 21, just before, Abraham has sent Ishmael and Hagar packing. He's basically, what's happened is, they wanted a son. They didn't have one. They didn't have an heir. And so back in chapter 16, I think, Sarah has this idea, why don't you go with my handmaiden Hagar and we'll have an heir that way, right? So they have Ishmael. Abraham basically marries Hagar as his second and junior wife, and they have an heir through her, right? But now Sarah has a son. She doesn't want there to be competition between the two of them, but she tells Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael packing, and he does. He basically responds to her the same way he responds to God. He goes, okay.
Isn't this the schism between
That happens way afterwards. I mean, we can maybe make some arguments that some of the people who become Muslims are Ishmael's descendants. That's what happens in the Middle Ages. But that's like 2,000 years after the fact, right? But so he has this other son, who he's already basically killed. Because what did he do? He sent them out into the desert basically to die. Now God does come and tell him, it's going to be okay, I'll make a great nation out of Ishmael too. So don't worry about it. But he's already been willing to send his son to death. So now all of a sudden thinking about him and Isaac, it actually isn't out of character. Right? And personally I take all of this as a sign of a lack of faith. He doubts that Ishmael and Isaac will be able to get along. And again, if we read forward in this book, right, what kind of stories are we going to hear? We're going to hear stories about Jacob and Esau, two brothers who don't get along very well, Joseph and his brothers, right? So if you already have all that in your head, there's a pretty good precedent here of maybe these two brothers won't get along, right? And
You're guessing.
I'm guessing, but there's a favored mother, just as there is in like these other stories, right?
And it goes back to Cain and Abel.
Right, it goes back to Cain. All of this is there. There's already all of this conflict between brothers. And so when we get here, we're like, well, there's probably going to be conflict. And here the conflict they basically get ahead of it by sending Ishmael off to die. He doesn't. Actually, he comes back, and Isaac and Ishmael bury Abraham together, right? I always think, like, which one of them is happier that he's dead? The one who got exiled or the one that almost got killed by him, right? I mean, think about that, right? Anyway. So that's one thing that happens, right? So we already have this sort of pattern of Abraham is willing to do this kind of thing. So it isn't necessarily he has great faith. He's willing to do what needs to be done to preserve his legacy. Right? Which is actually the problem with him killing Isaac is Isaac. Well, that's the problem, right? Is here that's actually, I mean, in a certain sense, that's potentially what he's being asked. It isn't only about his son. I hope he loves his son. But it's God basically saying, hey, remember that promise I made to you? I'd make a nation out of you, and all the world would be blessed through you, and it's going to come through an heir of yours and Sarah's, and now you have this son, which, by the way, was born according to the story when Sarah was 90 and Abraham was 100. I have some problems with that. But, right, so now, I mean, if let's say he's a teenager, let's say he's 12 or something, right, he's like 112 years old. They're not going to have any more kids, right?
Anything.
Right, you know? Maybe, right? But I mean, that's the whole idea. I mean, so what he's actually being asked to do is to terminate the promise. It's as if God is saying, remember that promise that I made? I'm taking it back. I want you to kill the child of the promise. And Abraham has to have faith. This is maybe where the faith part comes in. Of he has to have faith that God is still going to keep that promise somehow. Right, I'm going to come back to all that, but like
all of this is horrid.
It's all horrid.
But the part that's the most horrid, a burnt offering.
Yeah,
Excuse me.
yeah, right. I mean, this is so. By the way, that's why I have on the back of the handout. I'm not going to get to all of these, but I put a bunch of passages. There's a whole bunch more. I mean, child sacrifice is repeatedly condemned in the Old Testament. So why all of a sudden we have God commanding it is this surprise, right? It's out of step with what God does elsewhere, right? And it's actually how some people want to read this story. They want to read it as a parable, as Israel saying, look, we've got this story as to why we're opposed to child sacrifice. And I think that's probably a certain thing that's happening here, but there's more, right? So if we go back one chapter earlier, we see that Abraham is willing to kill one of his kids, basically. I mean, for all the intents and purposes, he sends Ishmael to his death, right? If we go back even earlier, think of some of the other things Abraham does. Let's think about Abraham. So he's depicted as this great man of faith, right? If you go back to the first page of my handout, on the bottom of the column where I have the story of Isaac, right? I've got the very beginning of the Abraham story in Genesis 12, where God says to Abraham, right, go from your country, leave your kindred and your father's house, and go to the land I will show you, right? So he does have great faith. God contacts him, says, go, and right, he does. He picks everything up and leaves. That's a sign of great faith, right? But the story's a bit more complicated than that. He doesn't actually go on his own. Who does he take with him besides Sarah? He takes a lot, right? So he takes a nephew and his family. So he does take part of his family. He doesn't go totally on his own. And actually, if we go a little bit earlier in chapter 11, God contacts Abraham's father Terah first to go to the land of Canaan. And then Terah dies, and so Abraham's kind of the backup plan, right? So things become ambiguous pretty quick, right?
It even says, because I will be against your enemies.
Yeah, right.
All that kind of stuff. It's like, okay. I'm going to make you great.
Yeah, exactly. But we're going to, again, there's some problems. So one of the other things I want to highlight is we get this frequent use of this idea of fear God. So faith is tied up with fearing God, right? So we should isolate what that whole idea of fearing God is. Fearing God doesn't mean being scared. Doesn't mean hiding behind the couch because the bad guy's coming, right? It also doesn't awe. It isn't like God is glorious and magisterial. Fearing God means you obey God. It's basically about morals and action. If you fear God, you do what God commands, right? It's about obedience and obeying God's word, right? So, I mean, if we fear God, we do what God asks of us because we have faith that things will work out, right? So, I've been doing our taxes, and I've got a bunch of 1099 forms for some little things that I've done. It'd be really easy for me to just hide those, right? I don't need to report this. I don't have to pay taxes on it, right? But that wouldn't be being dishonest. If I truly fear God, I'm going to do my taxes honestly and then trust that God will provide, that I can afford to pay the taxes, all those kinds of things, right? So that's one way to think of what this fear of God means, right? So Abraham is depicted as this man of great faith who fears God, right? But actually, if we read the story carefully, it seems that he fears other human beings way more than he fears God, repeatedly, right? So one, he and Sarah hatched this plan to have an heir. They're really worried about having a male heir. They don't have confidence that God is going to provide, right? God tells them to go to the land of Canaan in chapter 12. By the end of that chapter, they've gone to Canaan. They take a pit stop there, build an altar and worship God, and then they leave again. Seemingly they don't like it there. There's then a famine. They go to Egypt rather than having confidence that God will provide for them where they are. And what happens when they get to Egypt? Well, that's going to be way afterwards. But what happens when Abraham goes to Egypt? So when it's happened, this weird thing happens twice. He lies about his wife. Like evidently, Sarah is so beautiful. He's worried that the Egyptians are going to kill him. So he tries to pass her off as a sister, and the Pharaoh sees her and brings her into his house. Abraham gets paid handsomely for it. He basically whores out his wife, sells her to the Pharaoh, gets a dowry for it, gets camels and donkeys and sheep and male and female slaves. Right? He basically gives up on Sarah. He gives Sarah away. He's like, I'm going to save my own skin. And God has to intervene, and he plagues Pharaoh. It's actually a nice foreshadowing of the Exodus story. There's plagues, right? And the Pharaoh has to say, hey, Abraham, what's going on here? And Abraham goes, well, she's really my wife. And Pharaoh goes, why did you do this to me? And he gives her back, and he gets to keep all the things he got paid for, right? If we go forward a couple chapters, he does the same thing again with King Abimelech, right? Again, he's scared they're going to kill him. So he actually repeatedly acts to save his own skin because he's scared of more powerful people rather than having confidence that God is going to intervene. So this is the supposed great man of faith, repeatedly doesn't have it and takes things into his own hands and does terrible things. I mean, he gets rid of his wife twice. He basically sells her off. Makes a huge profit off of it, and then gets to keep it all and gets his wife back, right? And it's because God has to intervene and save him despite his own unfaithfulness over and over again. Give your hand. Just moving your block. You're raising your hand. Okay. Right? Sorry. Right? But I mean, this is the actual story of Abraham, right? Yes, he has this early moment of great faith, right? But most of the time, he's a total coward who's willing to kill his own kids, sell his wife off and basically abandon her, make a nice profit off of it. Right? Does it not once but twice, right? I always think it's no wonder Sarah laughs when she hears the angels talking about the fact that she's going to have a son in K90. She's like, God, you've been promising us this for 20-some years. And what's happened in the process of you guys have basically told me I'm expendable and just sold me off twice. She's probably probably happy to get out of that household, right? I mean, it's...
That's limited power.
Well, right? You know, I mean...
This to today.
I mean, it's right. I mean, this is the whole idea. And what happens repeatedly is God blesses Abraham. God gets him out of this hard spot he's gotten himself into. Blesses him with wealth. And they go on their merry way. Right? It isn't because Abraham's being particularly faithful. It's not a reward. It's like in spite of his behavior. I mean, that's what this whole Abraham story is really about, is God is faithful despite Abraham's lack of faith, over and over and over again. Right? He does have a few moments of courage, and I hate to say it, but it's only when he's saving men. He doesn't care about women. I mean, he's pretty terrible to his wife twice. He gets his courage up in it's chapter 18, I think, when Lot is in trouble. He actually musters a small army and goes and saves him. Why didn't he do that for Sarah? Why didn't he say, I'm going to have courage here and fight for her, right? So we can keep going on with this. I mean, the other place he has courage is when God comes and intervenes at Sodom and Gomorrah. It's Abraham who talks back. Says, well, what if there's 50 people? What if there's 40? It gets all the way down to 10, right? So there he's actually willing to sort of argue back with God. Why doesn't he do that with Isaac? Say, well, wait a minute, God, are you sure this is what you want to do? I mean, did I put it on here? Yeah, it's Genesis 18. If you turn the hand over towards the bottom, right? Abraham comes near and says, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous in the city. So he argues back, right? Why doesn't he go to God with this whole thing with Isaac and say, my son is young and innocent. Why are you going to kill him? Can't we do this a different way? But he's silent, right? I'm just trying to say, hey, this is a more problematic story than we think, right? So, I mean, this is, again, one of the big takeaways, I think, is to say Abraham does have moments of courage, does have moments of being faithful, but overall, the story that we get is him being scared of human beings more than he's scared of God, and being willing to sort of take things into his own hands rather than trusting that God is going to work everything out. But it's at the end of the day, who is the one who works everything out over and over and over again? It's God. God saves Sarah twice. God saves Ishmael and Hagar. It's not Abraham. Right? And maybe he does think, like the Hebrews passage tells us, that God's going to have him kill Isaac and he's going to prove his point and then he's going to raise him from the dead, right? He still has to go through with this awful thing. Right? So, just again, what do we do with this, right? I think if he really would have had better faith here, again, he would have said, I'm willing to die, take me, right? We go to the Gospel of John, we read that like a person who truly loves another is willing to die for them, right? But Abraham doesn't do this. He does nothing. He doesn't say anything back to God. Kierkegaard describes him as a sleepwalker. He just blindly does what God tells him.
Does he say that in Does he say that in...
He says that in Fear and Trembling.
Right.
Talks
So
about
does he say that in an endearing, positive way? Or is it
It's a really interesting book. The problem is he writes it under a pseudonym, and whenever he writes under a pseudonym, you don't know if he's actually speaking what he believes or if he's testing out an idea. But he gives 4 different ways to approach the story. But at least one of the things that he does is he thinks this is a positive thing. This is how we should have faith. We should just do what God tells us. Right? But again, there are other points where I'm going to destroy Sodom, and Abraham goes, well, wait a minute, is that really who you are? Right? Why didn't he do this again here with this Isaac story, right?
Could you look at it too, like God is operating a puppet, saying, okay, you do this.
But I mean, I think that's the
story.
But that's the element. Is like, I mean, we read the story as a whole. Like, it begins with God telling Abraham, do this thing, right? And Abraham does respond in faith. He says, okay, right? And I think we would lose something with this frequent sort of God asking us to have faith if God's in our heads making us have it. I mean, there's some human agency involved, right? So like he does, he goes up to this, takes Isaac, and they get everything ready, and again, there's all kinds of connections here, which I think we rightly can make to Jesus. Of Isaac has to carry the wood, Jesus has to carry his cross. I mean, there's a reason why we've made these kind of connections, right? But one of the big differences is that Jesus knows very well what's going to happen. He's going into this voluntarily. Isaac isn't, right? And again, we don't know. The only things we really get between Abraham and Isaac is we go read the passage. Isaac says to his father, this is verse 7, Father, and again Abraham says, here I am. Same thing he says to God, here I am, right? And Isaac says, the fire and the wood are here, but where's the lamb? And Abraham says, God will provide the lamb, right? So is this hope? Does he really have hope that God's going to bring the lamb at the last minute? Or is he just putting Isaac off? Again, we don't know what's going on inside the head. We have to figure it out. We have to at least sort of think about
What's Isaac's perspective?
And I think this is an important way to read these kind of stories, is to read them over and over again and to think, like, what is this character potentially thinking? We want to be careful and be aware that that's what we're doing, and we could be wrong, but it's a story that we're supposed to wrestle with, and not just, again, take blindly. Yep, Betty Jo.
I'm just thinking back in that day, everybody's told what to do. I mean, the Romans are, everybody's telling you what to do, what you're going to do, and you're going to do this. So, in a way, for them to blindly follow what they're told, I don't know, there's just kind of a gel there because it's back in that day. I don't know. I'm just getting that it's not like today, like, right. Whoa, Dad.
But I mean, that's the actual interesting thing about Abraham, is Abraham has been commanded by God to leave his homeland. He's basically a wandering nomad. He has no authority over him but God, right? And he is at times able to do some rather amazing things. I mean, when his nephew Lot gets kidnapped, he organizes an army and goes and takes him back. Right? He's not just doing what he's told often. In fact, he's quite independent, right? And again, what I'm trying to paint this picture is he doesn't always talk back to God, but he frequently doesn't do what God wants him to do, right? It's actually the sort of a norm, is he's unfaithful rather than faithful.
Is he trying to protect his wealth?
I mean, that's part of one of the ways to think about all of this, is what is he really up to? Is he thinks, he's trying to, protect himself. So twice the picture painted for us is, they're going to kill me to take my beautiful wife. I better lie and pass her off as my sister, right?
So maybe Lot was a business partner. I don't know.
Right, he's protecting himself. So that's part of this, is like him and Lot clearly are business partners, because at one point they have to argue about who's going to tend their sheep in which field, right? And they both get blessed, right? That's one of the questions I have when I read the story, is when he's clearly upset, I think. There's some elements in the story, like he is talking tenderly with Isaac, right? But what is he really worried about? Is he worried about losing his son, or is he worried about losing his legacy?
It isn't his son's legacy.
Yes, that's the problem. But it's like, where is he really worried? Is he worried because he loves his son?
He's a selfish misogynist.
That's kind of the problem, right? That's kind of the problem with this. Right, and so I think one way to sort of redeem him here at the end is to think, what does he do in this story? He finally proves to God that he's fearful of God too. He's not just fearful of the other human beings. And he may finally be getting around to the fact of, every time I've had to do something, God has gotten me out of the predicament that I'm in. God has been faithful every single time. He'll be faithful here too. But it's still an extremely awful thing to have to for God to ask of him. Right?
I didn't think of Isaac.
Yeah. Right. What is Isaac? What's going on with Isaac?
He's got lifelong trauma.
Absolutely. I mean, it's...
So, I mean, this is one of these things to me that, unfortunately, not probably taught it right at all, along with David,
Yeah.
who's held up as... David had a horrible life as well. And now I'm looking at it as, like, am I Abraham? Or am I David? And I think sometimes to be taught that I'm Abraham, or I'm David in my own life,
Yeah.
and that I have all these missteps, in raising our kids. Did I put my needs first? Do I put my needs over
Right.
Jane? Do I put my needs over? Which seems, that's an inherent thing in our lives,
Yeah.
in my own life. And so I'm wondering, are we looking at Abraham not as another human being like me, or did we put him on a false pedestal as a kid for being brought up, or has the church done that to make him something that he's not, and makes him unidentifiable with
Right.
us, as opposed to identifiable?
So that's part of what I'm trying to get you to see with this story is, right, I mean, we've been told to look to Abraham or to David as these sort of great people of faith that we should be imitating. And this story is used as like, look how faithful he is. He's even willing to sacrifice his own son for God. And I want to go, well, what's the story? Is this really an act of faith? Or is he trying to save his own skin one more time? It's one thing. And I think there is something refreshing, but also terrible at the same time, of like we're being given these portraits of these supposed great people of faith, right? And they're very flawed characters, right? And again,
All patriarchs.
right, and they're all right. I mean, that's just, I mean, there are some. I mean, Sarah is a problematic character in all of this too, right? In the terms of, I mean, she's treated very poorly, right, by Abraham, but I'm going to call it his unfaithfulness, it infects her too, because she's the one who wants Hagar and Ishmael gone, right? I mean, it's clearly they're a unit. God has called them together, right? And she's sometimes the brains of the operation. It sounds like, right?
Well, she wants to share the legacy.
Well, she wants to share the leg up, and that's part of this too, right? And I think this is the problem, is I think they do both really, truly have faith, but it's also tied up with this sort of our legacy. It's a mixture of good things and positive things, which is all of us, right? So I think this is one way to begin thinking about this. Is they're not only these examples of we should be like them. It's the real hero of this story is God. God is the one who's faithful over and over and over and over again. So Abraham isn't being rewarded for his faith. Excuse me. God is being faithful and doesn't ever give up on Abraham. I picked you. My promise is going to work through you, and we're going to make this work. Right? And that's one thing we should take away, is God is faithful when we're not. And God is the hero of the story. He's the major character. But then we should figure out what are we going to do with Abraham, right? And it's not as clear as we're oftentimes taught of he's this great hero of faith, right? I think he does demonstrate faith here. I think he really does think God's going to make this work, right? But we instantly go to the fact, and I think it's because of who we are and in the time and places that we are. We think about, like, I can never do this to my kid. I love my children, right? These are part of our cultural values. right? They're not necessarily Abraham's, right?
And those feelings are all God-given.
Right. I would think so, right?
So it's kind of this fight
Yeah.
within yourself.
But I think I just want to point out, like, something here. There's some other things we can talk about in the last couple of minutes. So if you look at my handout again, I mean, the idea of child sacrifice clearly is happening in the culture at the time. There are other peoples around them who are actively sacrificing children, right? But we've also got some of these things here of God does kind of claim the firstborn, right? And this is part of the ways I think we should understand Jesus, but also to sort of get this a story in its context. So if you look at Exodus 13, it's right in the middle of the other column, right? God tells them, you know, I brought you out of the land of Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, right? You shall set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb. So all the firstborn cattle, every firstborn donkey, you can redeem them. So this gets super complicated quick, but donkeys are unclean animals. You can't sacrifice them. You don't eat them. What do you do? They're pack animals. But rather than sacrificing them, because they're unclean anyway, you can redeem them by sacrificing a lamb. So it's like a trade, right? But he also says, every firstborn of a man or human beings among your sons you shall redeem. So you also have to offer a sacrifice for your firstborn children, right? Which again goes back to the Exodus, right? And of course, how does God punish Pharaoh? By killing the firstborn sons. Right? This is a theme. It's just buried in there, right? If we go to Numbers, we read, for all the firstborn among the Israelites are mine, both human and animal. And this actually explains why the Levites are the priests. God says, I picked them. Basically, the Levites are sacrificed, but they're redeemed and made into a tribe of priests. So they're given a task, right? Which is kind of getting into all these things of sacrificing things makes a thing holy, which doesn't mean it's morally perfect. It means that it's set apart, right? And then finally, I wanted to highlight Micah 6, right? This is this sort of famous passage. MLK made it famous, but he says, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sins of my soul? So should I do a child sacrifice? And it goes on to say, he has showed you, O human being, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God, right? That's again fearing God, obeying God's word, right? Which is about justice, right, and kindness, not killing your kids. But I mean, we get this story here, right? And part of what I want you to do with it is like, what do we do with this? This is a famous story. We've heard it over and over again, right? And the takeaways usually have faith like Abraham, right? I'm trying to point out to you, if you read this story carefully and put it in the full Abraham story, it's a much different story, right? And it actually becomes about God being faithful in the face of our sinfulness. Tim?
Is the stress on the firstborn because, this is the lawyer part of me, that is the legal means of succession of wealth. So if you destroy the firstborn in Egypt, which I'm assuming this tradition is probably there as well, you destroy the orderly disposition of succession of wealth, so you kill all the firstborn in Egypt.
It causes chaos.
Absolute chaos. So the emphasis on the firstborn then, and Because Ishmael's really the first one.
Yeah.
So Ishmael it has the birth.
Yeah, but see, that gets complicated too, because this is part of the problem, is they both have claims to be the heir.
Right, so he's made a mess of that.
Well, but the issue is that Sarah is the first a wife, and Hagar is a secondary wife. She's not just a second, she's a secondary, right? And so Isaac is actually the proper heir because of that, right? But they're there in the same space, right? And it actually, the text tells us that, I mean, if we go back to chapter, I think it's 20, Sarah sees them playing with each other. Now, there's got to be a huge age difference of at least 10 years. We're not told if Ishmael's being mean or if he's playing nicely, but she sees them playing and says, I want that kid out of here. My son's the heir, right? Because again, what happens if they go out playing one day in the wilderness and Isaac doesn't come home? Ishmael goes, I don't know what happened to him. I'm not my brother's keeper. Ishmael's there, right? But the thing is, God promised, I mean, God actually says when they go do this thing with Hagar and Ishmael, God says, that wasn't my plan. My plan is with you and Sarah. You were unfaithful. That's still going to happen. But when they send Hagar and Ishmael away, it's actually a sign of unfaithfulness. And we don't trust that God is going to make sure everything happens through Isaac. So we got to get Ishmael out of here. That's again, this other big major point is they don't trust that God is going to make things happen the way that God promised is going to happen. And they do what they have to do to sort of get what they want. And God's like,
They had no patience.
I mean, that's just us.
Yeah.
I wish in retrospect, and without being disparaging, we had, I mean, you, Matt, this is where you're so fabulous. I mean, you are for those that don't know these stories as we did growing up, I wish they would have said to me, Abraham is this imperfect human being, and this is how he lived his life. Instead of then trying to make these imaginary things up in my head about he and Noah and David,
right.
The judges. I mean, Samson is a bad guy. I mean, and yet these
right.
and we're always taught these are heroes. I mean, they're heroes.
Right, heroes of the Bible. Well, this is, I mean, if we go back to that Hebrews
and they are
11
heroes
passage.
in the sense that, I mean, in the sense that we're all that way. And it's okay that maybe it's not okay, we're bad, but this is how you live your life and this is what happens. As opposed to saying, like when you're a kid, you think Abraham's perfect. He's not. And now, you grow up with all this confusion about who these people are, and I'd rather have Abraham be imperfect. I can identify with that.
But that piece about God faithful to us.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of...
Well, I think that's the message. Like I mean, and again, we turn it into, I got to be like Abraham, rather than God's got my back. God's going to be with me constantly. God is faithful to me, even and especially when I'm not, right? And that should be the motivation then for being moral. It's that God's with me, and not if I don't do this thing, God's going to punish me, right? Because that's when we fall back into this Abraham trap of, I do think for a good deal of the story, his motivation is, what do I got to do to take care of me? Rather than, how can I live in a way that, shows love and justice to everyone around me and have confidence that God is going to take care of me, right?
Aren't all these stories about the human condition?
Absolutely. Right.
That's really what we're talking about. So we have to realize that there's good and bad in the human condition.
Anyway. Okay, well, I'll see you next week. Yeah.
Thank you.